Good afternoon and welcome to episode number 48 of At Your Service with Haber and Martinez. I'm Haber, and that over there is Martinez. Today's episode is entitled The Real World Nitty-Gritty Procedures, Protocols, and Practices for Securing, Serving, and Challenging Search Warrants. I'm going to go ahead and read off real quick, if you don't mind, from my promo that we did for the show today, because it'll give you a pretty good outline of what we're doing here. Sadly, the art of journalism is mostly dead, having been replaced by punditry. As such, we're bombarded by a pervasive opinion-based news cycle, which, rather than providing information, instead breeds ignorance and acrimony. That observed, unless you've been living under a rock for the past week or so, you've surely heard about the FBI's having served a search warrant on the residence of former President Trump. Unfortunately, albeit quite predictably, pundits on both sides of the aisle have chosen to obscure what we have called the real-world nitty-gritty procedure, protocol, and practice for securing, serving, and challenging search warrants, opting instead to engage in what I'm going to call electioneerings, and doing that which they do best, which is stoking the political flames in one direction or the other. So on today's show, I want to be very clear. We are going to have a comprehensive discussion about search warrants. And while we will discuss the nitty-gritty aspects of all sides of this equation, what we are not going to do is engage in any political diatribe, make any political statements, or offer any political commentary. So this is not a politics show, and we are not assigning blame or right or wrong or good or evil or nefarious intent. We're not taking sides with the FBI, the Department of Justice, ex-President Trump, whatever. But that's our fulcrum for this conversation. And the reason that we're having it is what I first said. It's really annoying. You know, when we were kids, Ed, when you and I were kids, we could put on the news and we could watch bona fide journalists.
Right.
Anchors who took to the screen and told you facts, not gave opinions, not offered explanations, not made excuses or spun stories. They gave you information cut and dry. Just as a judge is supposed to do in a criminal courtroom or in any courtroom, they're supposed to be like an umpire calling ball and strikes. I don't care if you grew up in Philadelphia, if you're an umpire and you're at a Philadelphia game and you're umping it, you can't go with the team that you like. You have to be neutral and detached. And if you can't, then you cannot work that game.
Unless you're reffing the national championship, UM versus Ohio State, and then he cheated. No, I'm kidding.
So my point is that what we have in today's 24-hour news cycle and what we're getting on all of the networks, I don't care which one you watch. I don't care if it's a network TV network, a cable network. I don't care if you're on the left, if you're on the right, if you're in the middle. 98% of what you see on TV, 98% of what you read on social media, 98% of what is repeated to you by other people who are getting their information from TV and social media is punditry. It is opinion. It is not fact. And so it really pisses me off, for lack of a better term, when I'm watching all this coverage and hearing this nonsense political diatribe, avoiding the real nitty-gritty, real-world aspects of what is a search warrant, how do you get a search warrant, what are the rights of the government, what are the rights of the accused or the target, where does a lawyer get involved, what can a defense lawyer do, what is the remedy if you find that it was a bad warrant or that it was overreaching, or if there was some ulterior motive, or if somebody lied, or if there was impropriety. How do you deal with all these things? Going back to the original point of the FBI's recent search at Mar-a-Lago, we don't have any of those answers.
None.
We have virtually none of them. And so coming to conclusions on one side of the fence or the other is reckless. And it's more political than it is factual. So our job here is to talk about facts. And I have to go backwards and start with a little bit of history, as I like to do. Those of you who know me know I'm a history guy. Etymology is one of my favorite words. But before I start with that, Ed, was there something you wanted to say?
I just want to add briefly, because it's happening from attorneys as well, not only on TV, but with our colleagues. If you're not a criminal defense lawyer, please stay out of this discussion, only because it's very charged right now. and you don't really understand what's going on if you haven't either A, as a prosecutor, applied for these warrants, or B, as a defense attorney, had to either argue against them or review them. Okay, some of the guys on TV who are former prosecutors have also slightly politicized it. Now, I can read through their BS because, Michael, you and I know what they're saying when they're kind of saying, well, this could be that, or it could be this. Yes, it could be that. And if my mother had handlebars and wheels, she could be a bicycle. But it's reckless on their part to say that.
Of course, your mother could identify as a bicycle right now if she wanted to.
She probably could. But
and we'd have to respect that.
She's a little old, so if she identified as it would be those big ones.
Maybe she'd identify as a walker.
She'd identify as bicycles.
A trike.
The official one. No, the first ones had the big front wheel with the little back wheel. You had to climb up on them. That's what she identifies.
I want to go back a little bit, and I want to talk about how we got to where we are. So let's just spend a couple minutes strolling down history lane. If our producer would put up picture number 1, I would appreciate it. Okay, so this is like a caricature of the writ of assistance. And if you look at this, what you can really see is basically a writ of assistance is a written order. It was given to some law officer, customs official, or some minion of the crown to then go and do the crown's bidding. Thank you. You can pull that picture down. Please remove image number 1, producer. Thank you. So today, we still have a writ of assistance, but it's got a very different meaning than it did back in colonial times. So you have to understand that in colonial times, again, what we're dealing with is colonists that populated the original 13 colonies came from Europe. And most of them were subjects of the British Crown. Not all, but most. And because of that, regardless of the fact that they had sailed west across the ocean, they were still subject to the rule of the king. And so the king had all sorts of eyes and ears here in the colonies to report back. And when we get to picture number 2, which I guess we could put that up now because I'm going to kind of dovetail them together. Go ahead and put up picture number 2 for a minute. This is a representation of what was called the Navigation Act. And the Navigation Act was an act of parliament back in colonial times, which was basically intended to promote self-sufficiency of the British Empire by way of restricting and controlling all colonial trade. So if you look at this chart and you see in the red, you've got goods going out of England. You have tea and spices and furniture and cloth and tools, things like that were being manufactured in England, being shipped over to the colonies and also to Africa. But then what you have is you have certain things coming from Africa, particularly slaves and gold, going into the West Indies, and you have certain things coming out of the colonies, flour, fish, meat, lumber, whale oil, tobacco, cotton, all of the things that were being cultivated out of the colonies and sent back. Okay, you could take down image number 2. Thank you. So the writ of assistance and the Navigation Act, how do they intertwine? What is the connection? Why am I bringing them up? Well, what happened is basically you've got the British Crown monitoring everything. You could not send goods from the colonies directly to Africa or to any of the outposts in the Caribbean or to any other place. They had to go to England first in order to be assessed, in order to be cataloged, and most importantly, in order to be taxed. And then, of course, the Crown was able to extract their due, their percentage. It was only through this type of incredible micromanagement that the Crown was able to do these things. Remember, you're going back to the 1600s and the 1700s. Forget internet. You didn't have phones. You couldn't send pigeons across the ocean. The only way that you could get a message from England to America was about a 3.5-month cruise across the Atlantic. So that's literally how things happened there. Are you flagging because you want to say something?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, because it looked like you were...
No, sorry, I was scratching. Go ahead.
All right, so anyhow, you've got this dynamic going on, right? And the Crown is really concerned about a couple things. Number one, their first priority is power, right? I mean, any monarch is always first and foremost concerned about losing their ability for power and control. But how do you keep power and control? Money, right? If you have money, you have power. Remember the old line out of Scarface, right? That
Right.
actually was time tested and proven true from the colonial times. So you have all of these things going on. Now, again, remember that at this time, you got 13 colonies that have very different structures. They have very different populations. They have very different products that they develop. They have very different commerce that they engage in. Imagine the difference between a place like Boston and a place like South Carolina. Virtually nothing in common at that time, except they had one common denominator, and that was they did not like, and you know this phrase, taxation without representation. They did not like the fact that the king, 3,000 plus miles away, was sucking away their resources, and they were getting nothing for it. They didn't have anybody in parliament speaking on their behalf. They didn't have anybody weighing their interests. They just had people controlling and taking. And when the king started to get paranoid, or whenever any of his subjects or any of his minions decided that they wanted to exercise a little extra control, who would they take it out on? The colonials. And after a while, colonials had it. And that's ultimately what led us to the Revolutionary War. Obviously, you know things like the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, etc. It seems like all this stuff happened in Boston. Boston was like the hotbed for everything. And at that time, you have to understand, Boston was all of 1 square mile. That was it. That was all of Boston. So it was a big deal at that time. But there were 2 things that happened, and I just want to bring them up because they're historically interesting to me. And it's called the Malcolm Affair. And these were precursors, other things that added to the tempest in the teapot right before the Revolutionary War. So on September 24th of 1776, there was a Boston merchant who was served with one of these writs of assistance. And he said, no, I'm not complying. And why did he not want to comply? Well, he didn't want to comply because he was operating his business out of his house. So these minions of the king came to his home armed with this writ of assistance and decided they were going to go through everything, including his wife's panty drawer probably, looking for whatever it was that they were allegedly looking for. And he said no, and he didn't allow it. And this turned into a big legal battle. Fast forward a couple of years later to January 25th of 1774, and there was a customs officer named John Malcolm, who was a loyalist. He was a guy that worked for the king. And he got into an argument with some kid on the street about these writs of assistance. This turned into a complete and utter shit show. And this guy wound up getting his head bashed in because he picked a fight with the wrong colonist. And that was one of these tempest in a teapot moments that ultimately led to the Revolutionary War. For anyone who's interested, it was a guy named George Hughes, Hewes, who was a shoemaker, who wound up bashing in John Malcolm's head. Anyhow, we fast forward to, go ahead and put up pick 3. Why not? May as well put up pick 3 for a minute. That's a representation of the Malcolm Affair. The first incident, by the way, that I mentioned, the one from September of 1776, when they resisted the writ of assistance, they wound up tar and feathering this guy Malcolm, who was the guy serving the writ. And that was one of the things that got back to the king, which of course caused retribution. All right, you could take that one down and put up number 4, because that's going to take us to present day. So now we have the Revolutionary War. We kick King George's soldiers' ass. We have our own country, and we create our own constitution. And you are now looking at the text of the 4th Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Okay, you could take that one down for us now. So, this is our fundamental starting point. Now you know how we got where we got. You know why we got where we got. Because we were fed up with these random, I feel like searching and there isn't anything you can do about it, and you really have no recourse against it searches. Right. So we have a 4th Amendment that says, no, that's not going to fly in our new republic democracy, democratic republic. So there are certain buzzwords in the 4th Amendment. The first buzzword is unreasonable search and seizure. We're going to hit each of these in order, but I'm going to run through them again real quick. The second is warrant be issued upon probable cause. The third is supported on oath or affirmation. The fourth is with particularity describing the things to be searched or the persons to be seized or the place to be searched. So with that background, we get to modern day, okay? And I want to start by talking about, and I want to back this up just a dash, because I know Ed has been very patiently quiet, but
this is Ed's, so far, my friend.
This is Ed's moment to shine, because at this moment, we're going to get into the government's burden, the protocols and procedures and practices to secure a search warrant. Ed was a prosecutor for several years. He was also a specialty prosecutor in a couple of divisions, but the one for our purposes that we'll focus on right now is narcotics. During Ed's tenure as a specialized narcotics prosecutor, he worked in tandem with government agents to secure warrants. He assisted law enforcement officers in drafting affidavits. He assisted in the presentation of those affidavits, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but he probably was present when some searches were conducted. So
we could be, but not often.
That being the case, I'm going to turn it over to Ed to start going through, and I'll chime in when appropriate, to talk about what is it that has to be done to get a warrant. What evidence needs to be presented? What is an affidavit? What does it mean? Who writes it? What does it need to say? What is the probable cause standard? How tailored does it have to be? Etc. What is the function? What is it that the government must do? And how is it that they get that warrant, Ed?
And you know me, I'll try and make it as simple to understand, but comprehensive, completely comprehensive. So the first thing is the officer comes to the prosecutor, which in this case, it's the way it always is.
Do they always go to a prosecutor?
Always, because they don't have a prosecutor, believe it or not, is law enforcement. Why? Because we're the legal arm of law enforcement. So when the law enforcement officer thinks he's got something, he's right. He may be right. He then goes to a prosecutor when you're getting a warrant. Why? Because now we're getting the court involved beyond just probable cause arrest on the street of an officer, right? Secondly, it's very invasive, and we all recognize it's extremely invasive. So even law enforcement wants to get it right. They don't want to go into somebody's house when they really shouldn't have been there for many reasons, if nothing else, because then you lose the evidence and you lose the case. So a prosecutor, I'm telling you, is always involved. They would bring it to me and we would review it. We review it for probable cause. Now, there is an affiant that has to swear out to the probable cause. The affiant is the guy that has to say, or woman, that says, I know because I have personal knowledge of XYZ. And XYZ could be, Michael, as you know, God knows. There's so many things. We'd be here for 2 hours telling you what could be the XYZ that gives that officer probable cause. But they have to be able to articulate it in the warrant, or in the affidavit rather, and they have to be able to independently corroborate it. So, for example, let me give you just one example that's not going to fly. Officer says, hey, I spoke to a confidential informant or some guy, an anonymous source or a leak or somebody who works in the company. Okay. And what'd they tell you? Well, they work there or they know this. And they say that Michael Haber is doing XYZ. That's not enough. That's just not enough. I need to somehow independently corroborate that as best as I can. Sometimes it's bank records.
When you say I, are you talking about the prosecutor or talking about the affiant?
Well, the law enforcement. Law enforcement, being the officer and the prosecutor, are now working together. In that situation, a prosecutor would say, look, that's just not enough. Let's independently corroborate it. What is it? Drugs? Well, here are factors that we can look into. Are the air conditioning unit, recycling or not, if it's a grow house? Does he have some things that look suspicious? If it's an economic crimes case, we could subpoena bank records under seal that the bank will never tell Michael Haber that I subpoenaed his bank records. So you'd have to still independently corroborate it. And why? Because of what Michael said. The founding fathers wanted to make sure that there was no chance of tyranny leaking in to these searches as they had in the past. So it has to be completely reasonable. There's no unreasonable search. No, well, my neighbor said that, the neighbor said he's committing a crime. That's not enough. They have to have something. Now,
By the way, I'm going to interrupt just for a second because it's not just tyranny, right? There are other motives.
Oh,
Could
yeah.
be revenge. Could be they're trying to get somebody out of the way. You know,
A rival gang member, a
could
rival
be
drug dealer.
politics. Could be any of a million reasons.
You'd be surprised how many rival gang drug dealers try to get the other drug dealers arrested. It's smart business, more business for them. So here comes the other part. Well, what do you get on a warrant? Well, the affidavit has to be very particular. The affidavit that goes to that judge has to be very specific and very particular under oath.
Let me just chime in for 1 second to make sure the audience understands. An affidavit is a written statement. It is a document that is reduced to writing that is sworn to by the affiant or the affiant, tomato, tomato.
You know how you say it.
Right. It's a document that is sworn to. So it is subject to perjury prosecution if there is, intentional, if it rises to the level of what would be considered a criminal act.
By the way, that's now what's happening with, I believe, it's the Breonna Taylor case. They're now looking at indicting the officers who were the affiants on the warrant because they believe that these officers lied to get that warrant. So that could be a huge problem for somebody to lie.
So I want the folks to understand. Part of this protocol requires, it's not, now, I also want to just add one other thing, just to be clear. You don't just send it by email. You've got to appear in person in front of a judge because you actually have to be placed under oath. Go ahead. I don't want to take your steam, but I want to make sure that the folks understand that what should happen, this is not to say that it does happen or it did happen or it will happen or it won't happen. It's just to say the ideal. The concept is the judge is supposed to read the affidavit, and then if there are any questions, follow up and ask them. That's why you've got to have a body there to be able to be placed under oath so that that person is now on the record with the judge. But here's the kicker. All of this that Ed is talking about right now is ex parte.
Right.
The defendant doesn't know that any of this is happening.
Correct.
And they're not entitled to be involved in any of this process or protocol. They're
Absolutely
not entitled to any notice.
And there's a good reason for it. And that's what I was going to get to. So
we'll get there. Go ahead.
So it has to be very particular. You have to be very, very specific. And to be honest with you, even though all you have to do is probable cause, most of these warrants or most of law enforcement understands that it's got to be a little more than probable cause. It's got to be rock solid probable cause, right? So you take that to the judge. But here's the kicker when you appear. Now, if it's a big case, the prosecutor will go. I used to go. Or if I like the judge, if I know him, just to hang out and talk to him in chambers. But I didn't have to. Law enforcement can go. But the affidavit has to be particular on the facts that you have. But what you're seeking becomes very wide. So that net that you want to cast is wide, and there's a reason for it. You go to the judge says, well, this is what I know that these are the facts that you're saying you have to show probable cause of a crime. But what do you think you're going to find, officer? Now, again, let's look back at just one of 1,000 examples I could give you. It's Michael Haber's house, and we're told that Michael Haber is committing XYZ crime. How do I find it? What do I know? Give me the crime. It doesn't matter. How do I know where he's got the evidence? In a drawer, in his bathroom, in his closet, in his car, in his garage, in the shed in the backyard. You don't really know where it is, and it makes sense, right? Because as Michael said, we're not going to be talking to Michael's lawyer. We're not going to be talking to Michael. We've got somebody that has given us something, but we don't have enough to arrest Michael. So obviously, we know there might be something going on here. We think very strongly that something is going on, but we're not 100% sure where it would be. But within that comes the particularity of what you're describing. So let's say, for example, in a house is a good example to use. When we would draft these warrants, the way to draft the warrant is you've got to be able to describe that particular house or structure to the exclusion of every other structure in the jurisdiction. Like, for example, not to get political, but the Trump Mar-a-Lago, that's going to be pretty easy to describe, right? There's no other Trump Mar-a-Lago in Dade County, Florida. So you could
actually, there's no Trump Mar-a-Lago in Dade County, Florida at all.
I'm sorry, where is it? In West Palm?
Palm Beach.
Palm Beach. So there's no other Mar-a-Lago in West Palm. There could be one in Dade, but remember, we're talking about the specific jurisdiction. Trump Mar-a-Lago with the address and maybe a couple other things to identify it. You're golden. There's no other one. Now, what is it that you're looking for?
And where in the premises are you looking for it?
Right.
Because again, remember what we told you about the word particularity.
Right.
That is a absolutely clutch element. Now, I want to cut you off just for 1 second because we're going to talk about this a little bit later. A lot of this analysis, and this is why this whole President Trump situation is so screwy, a lot of this analysis cannot be done until after the facts have surfaced.
Correct.
After the affidavit has been disclosed and after the charges have been filed, when you can now look back with 2020 hindsight and say, did they do it right? Did they follow the protocol? Did they meet the constitutional requirements? But you can't even begin to assess that until after the fact. It's impossible.
Right. And so one of the issues that Michael and I have is when people are saying, well, he could show everybody the warrant. The government could show everybody the warrant. Merrick Garland needs to show everybody the warrant. That will tell you absolutely nothing. Let me give you an example of what the warrant that they're seeking for Donald Trump would say. And I haven't seen it, but I've seen thousands. Something along the lines of they have probable cause to believe that such and such federal statute has been violated, leading to such and such a crime, and therefore they're looking for any documents, tangible evidence, videos, cameras. It's just a litany because you don't know what you're going to find. What you have is probable cause. Now, what is the probable cause based on?
Wait a minute.
The affidavit, but
exactly.
That's not going to be in the warrant.
That's the key. Warrant. That's the key point here. Again, remember, this is all ex parte. The only documents that are going to be given to the defendant and or the subject, the target, whatever you want to call them, the only documents that person are going to get is the face sheet of the warrant and what they call the return, which is whatever it is that they happen to seize. But even the return won't be itemized. It's not going to give you a list of everything they took. So, for example, in a case like this, it may say one box containing documents.
That's it.
It's not going to list the documents. Now, at some point, if there are charges filed, everything will have to be tendered, and all those things will have to be itemized and cataloged. Correct. And, then you can examine each and every one of them. But the point is, nobody knows. Today, the only people who know are law enforcement. And unless somebody from law enforcement decides to leak it, which would be a quick path to prosecution themselves, that affidavit's going to remain under seal. And therefore, none of us are going to know any of the details or specifics that led to that magistrate judge signing off on that warrant.
And the reason is very simple. Think of it from a law enforcement point of view. Whether it doesn't matter where you are. Let's be completely objective. See it from a law enforcement point of view. If they're coming in with a warrant to seek some evidence of a specific crime, if Michael now, who again is the target, knows that his best friend is the one that told us what was going on, well, Michael, if he really is up to no good and he really is violating the law and committing a crime, now he'll know where to go to sabotage the evidence, where to get rid of the evidence, right? So you can't really let him know too much because Michael might be able to figure out what the hell exactly we're looking for.
Well, that's why they don't let you know anything.
Because they're worried about you destroying the evidence. Including advising you that they're coming to do a search. Correct. You don't get advance notice. They just show up. So as a matter of fact,
one of the things
on that subject, if they come to see you without a warrant and they believe that you're destroying evidence, they can use that as a mitigating as an aggravating factor. What do they call it?
Exigent circumstance.
An exigent circumstance. Thank you. An exigent circumstance to go in without a warrant,
which is an exception to the warrant requirement. But we're not really going into that.
Is not going to let you destroy evidence.
But they've got to have the warrant, right? They've got to have the warrant in advance to serve it. Now, that what Ed's talking about is a slightly different topic, which I'm going to just give you a moment on when we get to that point.
Right. I just want to point out why the warrant is not any different. Their fear is
we're going to cover that in terms of evidence. We're going to cover that. We're going to cover that in terms of executing.
And by the way, I left something out, Michael. When an officer or law enforcement, the government, prosecutor, everybody submits the warrant to the judge, and the judge signs it, you have 10 days to serve that warrant. A warrant can become stale. You can't just get a warrant and sit around and say
that's also on my list of. That's on my list of stuff coming up. But let me
have the evidence and be ready to rock and roll with the evidence you got. That's enough to get you it. And only the judge knows, because you don't want to let the target know what the hell's going on too much, because then they're going to destroy the evidence. And that's a legitimate thought. If you've committed no crime, You've got nothing to worry about. You don't really care what's in the affidavit. If you've committed the crime, you may want to know what's in the affidavit to stop them from finding other evidence.
But you're never going to know that.
Right. I want to throw one thing in that many people don't understand, because I know this may come up when that affidavit comes out. And the right might get super explosive and incensed. It is pattern and practice, very typical, to put into a warrant that you are seeking evidence that may lead to evidence of a crime. You understand? So while they may not get the smoking gun with this warrant, they may have been looking for evidence that would lead them to the smoking gun. And that's okay. The government can get a warrant because they have probable cause to believe that you have evidence that would lead to evidence of the crime. Does that make sense?
Yes. Let me go back for 1 second, because I want to make sure that folks understand this very plainly. You've got the government's role, okay? Their role is to prosecute cases. That's their job.
Regardless of who it is.
It's not, they are there to seek out and to expose and to prosecute criminal acts. You've got the court's role. The court's role is to serve as a neutral and detached arbiter, to examine the affidavit, and if the affidavit on its face constitutes probable cause, then to issue a warrant, however, to restrict that warrant to the particularity requirement of the Fourth Amendment. In other words, they can't just let them go on an unbelievable fishing expedition. And that's a burden that the judge who reviews the affidavit has. There's a separate burden for after the fact if you want to allege that there was overreaching. And I'll give you a quick example, but we'll talk more about it later. Let's say, for instance, they're looking for a stolen elephant from the circus, and they're going through your panty drawer in your dresser. It's not going to fly because there's no reasonable possibility that that elephant could be in the panty drawer. Now they may come up with a creative argument and say, well, maybe you were keeping the elephant peanuts in the panty drawer.
Exactly. You nailed it. And here's my point. If they did the warrant correctly or the affidavit correctly, they said they were seeking for any evidence of an elephant or any evidence that would what? Lead to the elephant. So you could argue that you're seeking peanuts because that's what elephants eat, and that's where you're storing his treats.
And that's what seasoned law enforcement and prosecutors are going to do. They're going to find a way to cover their tracks. But I want the folks to know, again, that's the court's role, is to serve as that neutral arbiter. And because this is an ex parte process, the judge has an additional burden, and that is to ensure due process to the target. You can't call the target and let them know they don't have a right to be present. They don't have a right to argue. Kind of like at a grand jury, you don't have a right. You may be subpoenaed. You could invoke the fifth, but you don't have a right to present your own evidence. It's the prosecutor's case and only the prosecutor's case. Similarly here, the defense has no role whatsoever in this process of securing the warrant. We haven't gotten to service of the warrant yet. We're just talking about securing it. So the judge has that burden of ensuring due process of law for the target. And what does that mean? It means that the government cannot deprive a citizen or anybody who's accused while they are in the geographical confines of the United States of America. They cannot attempt to deprive them of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The process is still ex parte. The Fourth Amendment only protects against the government. It does not protect against private citizens. So if I call the government, if Ed and I are roommates and I call the police and say, I just found, a freezer full of kidneys in Ed's bedroom, there's going to be no Fourth Amendment search requirement when I let the police in. Even if I had no ability to go into Ed's room and I was not permitted to go in there and I kicked the door in or used a battering ram, that's not on the government, unless I'm a confidential informant who's working with the government. But if I call them on my own as Dudley Do-Right citizen, the Fourth Amendment is completely inapplicable. And again, it's only for reasonable expectations of privacy. If you do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy, the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to you to begin with.
Right.
So now let's shift gears and go into the execution.
So where did I leave off? All right. So now, so we've got the warrant from the judge. And again, like Michael said, I want to make it crystal clear. You can't put this on the judge if somebody lied on the affidavit.
I do want to add one other.
You're a liar.
I do want to add one other thing. Here in the state of Florida, only a judge can issue a warrant. It must be a judge. In the federal system, it's different. Magistrate judges issue warrants, and magistrate judges are not judges. They are not appointed by the president and conferred by Congress for life. They're appointed politically through their own districts. So they are not the same level as a federal judge. They're a magistrate judge. Doesn't mean they're not powerful. Doesn't mean that they don't have authority. It just means that it's different in the federal system than it is in the state system.
Since this is a federal case, let's look at the Trump case. The Trump case, while he is in Florida, it's the federal government that's looking to arrest him under a federal statute, so they could use a magistrate. If it was a state case, like when I was a prosecutor as a state,
got to be a judge.
It would have to be a judge, and it would have to be a state judge.
I want to run through some of my bullet points here on executing warrants, and then, Ed, I'm going to let you go wherever you want to go with it. But let me go through my bullet points. As matters of Florida law, okay, and this may differ from state to state because each state has its own, protocols and procedures, and it may at some degree vary for federal law enforcement. But these are essentially pretty much common sense across the board items. One, again, this is ex parte when they go to secure the warrant. So at the same time, executing warrants is also ex parte. There's never going to be a phone call to the target or to the target's lawyer, even if you know them, even if, as they've been reporting, that President Trump and his team were working with the FBI and the National Archives and blah, blah, blah. Makes no difference. It's irrelevant. You can have all the good blood in the world. Once the warrant is secured, you're not getting a heads up. You're not getting a phone call. They are going to show up with no notice. Now, one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to have what's called a knock and announce. Hey, we're here. We got a warrant. We'd like you to open the door. Or they're going to have what's called a no-knock warrant where they can simply kick your door in and they can force entry. In order to have a no-knock, it's got to be specifically stated on the warrant. You have to have authorization here in the state of Florida from that judge at the outset to serve a no-knock warrant. Otherwise, it's presumptively knock. They have to tell you. So
I've never seen one.
Don't confuse this with they're going to call you and say, hey, giving you a heads up, we're on our way there. They're going to show up at your door, they're going to knock and announce, or they're going to kick your door in, one of the two.
And knock and announce, so you're crystal clear. The case law is crystal clear. There's no time. It's not like they have to wait 30 seconds or a minute. Right. All they have to do is knock, announce, and then they can break the door down.
These are almost always, because of that, the practical realities, they are almost always done by surprise, right? And police like to do this very early in the morning because most people are not early risers. So if they show up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, the odds are you're going to really be surprised. They're going to catch you with your literal pants down, and they're going to be able to serve the warrant easily. Now, that's not to say this is how it always happened. And after Ed comments, when I get done with these bullet points, I'll tell you guys a story about a case that I had where the police were what we call lying in wait. More bullet points for executing warrants. You have absolutely no right to counsel during the execution of a warrant. That's not to say you can't call your lawyer and your lawyer can't show up, but your lawyer has no authority to involve him or herself in that process, and law enforcement is never going to allow it. You have no right to watch or to supervise. They may want you to walk with them. They may invite you to walk with them, but you have no right to say, I want to see what you're doing. Doesn't work that way. Yes, you are entitled to see the face sheet of the warrant before they come into your premises and search, unless it's a no-knock. They have to show it to you, and yes, they are required to give you the return when they leave. But again, there will be no affidavit, and that return is not going to be detailed. It's going to be a basic statement of what they took. The two priorities and the reason for all of this are, as Ed said, destruction of evidence and officer safety. Those are the two biggest concerns. They're always worried about what might happen when they show up to serve a warrant, and they're always worried not only about their own safety, but what might happen to evidence. So if you're a drug dealer, and you can think back to the scene in Goodfellas when Karen starts flushing the cocaine down the toilet, right? You can't get a better example of why the police would not give you a call and say, hey, we're on our way to execute a search warrant, because then they're not going to catch you dumping the cocaine down the toilet and trying to flush it. It'll already be gone. My last bullet points are some police officers are more courteous and professional than others. Okay, that's just the reality of the job. Just like anything else in life, some doctors have a better bedside manner than others. No matter what it is that you do, some bus drivers are going to stop and let you run up to the bus even though you're a half a block away. Others are going to take off, right? So again, referring back to Goodfellas, there was a scene where Karen is talking about how, the other women would ask the police if they wanted coffee, and then they'd spit in the coffee and give it to them. And she's like, I just can't understand how people could do that. Well, similarly, there are some officers who are going to be worse than others. They're going to trash your place. Others are going to be more respectful. Just the nature of the game. As far as what happens with the affidavit and with the evidence, all of that is going to be sealed unless and until charges are filed 99.9% of the time. You're not going to ever see those documents or the physical items until after the government has decided what they want to do with that. And then finally, videotaping. They are never going to allow you to follow them with a video camera. If you have home surveillance, you better hope you have an off-site server, because if they know they're being video surveilled, they may kill your video. They may actually stop it, and they shouldn't. The truth is, it's a great defense argument later if we have to try and fight this, especially if it's in front of a jury. It won't fly so well in front of a judge, but the argument is real simple about, ladies and gentlemen, if the police had nothing to hide, if they were really there doing their job appropriately, not only would they be recording it, but they would want it recorded. And the truth is, good professional cops who are serving warrants and know what they're doing love to have their body cam on, because then there is absolutely no question about what was said, what was done, what was seen, especially when they show up at Mar-a-Lago looking for documents, but they find 16 kilos of cocaine sitting on a party table that was in plain view. So I'm not saying that happened, by the way. I'm using that as, complete hyperbole example. But the point is, if the police are legitimately on the premises serving a search warrant looking for crime X, but they happen to see evidence of crime Y right in front of their faces in plain view, that's going to be clearly admissible in a proceeding later. So with those bullet points for executing warrants, Ed, let me give you a few minutes to go ahead and comment on that.
So again, as Michael pointed out, it's ex parte because we can't let the target know. Mainly at that point, serving the warrant is for destruction of evidence, right? And that's why they do serve you by surprise. They are supposed to knock and announce. And again, like Michael said, it all depends on the officer and the unit. Some cops knock, announce, and break the door down. Some cops knock, announce, and give you a couple of minutes, a minute or two to come out. Again, it all depends also what they're seeking, right? If you know that there's a voluminous amount of documents, there's no possible way they could shred it in a minute. So you give them a minute or two, but they're not going to give you much time because that's their job. I mean, it is what it is. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just delivering the facts.
And the other issue there is officer safety, right? Because if they're going to serve a warrant on a paper case, they're always concerned about officer safety, but they're probably less concerned on a paper case than if they're going to serve a fugitive warrant, let's say.
Right, or a drug dealer. But that brings me to the why aren't you allowed to walk around the house with them? Well, Michael, suppose you're the target, and we think that you've, tax evasion. Basic, simple, just, tax evasion guy.
Paper case.
We serve the warrant, and we start looking around your house, and we find a trap door in your house, and you know that you've got about 6 dead bodies in there. That might make you pick up whatever firearm you have hidden somewhere in the house that nobody's found yet and start shooting cops because you know you're going down for multiple murders. You never know what's going to happen. So this is why they don't let you follow around. Or maybe you think you're going to get away with whatever crime you're committing, and you thought you were smart and cool by hiding whatever documents we're seeking in your wife's panty drawers. And when we go to your wife's closet to look for the panty drawers, you flip out, and again, you start trying to shoot these cops. That's the reason they don't let you watch.
The same applies for lawyers. You have no right. You can say, I want my lawyer present till you're blue in the face. And your lawyer could show up, but they're not letting the lawyer have any part of that process or protocol. The lawyer will sit outside waiting with everyone else.
There's a reason for that, and I guess I'm going to jump right now to that because I was going to talk about the face sheet of the inventory, but I'll talk about that later. There's a reason why your affidavit is sealed, that you don't have a right to see it, and the same reason why your lawyer has no business in the serving of a warrant. You have not been charged with any crime yet. You haven't been charged. You You haven't been arrested. There's nothing going on other than we just want to see. They just want to look and see what they have. So you haven't been charged. You haven't been arrested. You don't need to see the affidavit normally because it's not going to affect your life, Michael. Maybe your neighbors saw that the cops came, but that's about it. You don't need the affidavit to show to the world why the cops were searching your house. Hence why I think maybe the Trump one might be a little different. But the reality is you want to know what protocol is. Protocol, you don't get the warrant. You get the warrant. You don't get the affidavit.
You just get the face sheet.
That's it. You just get the face sheet. You don't get the affidavit because it really is not going to affect you unless and until
you're charged.
They arrest you. And that's when your lawyer gets the affidavit. He's going to get it. And that's when they're going to review to see if, in fact, there was probable cause to serve the warrant.
That's where I want to stop you because it goes right into my next segment.
Okay.
My next segment is when we fast forward in time and a case is filed and you go from being a target of a warrant to a criminal defendant in a courtroom facing actual charges, your lawyer may want to challenge the warrant. There's a United States Supreme Court case called Franks, okay? And Franks is the case that sets out the standard for challenging a search warrant. It's actually the standard to determine whether or not the affidavit floats. And I'm going to read you the exact language. In Franks, the site for any of you want to hear it, it's Franks v. Delaware, 438 U.S. 154, 1978. In the Franks case, the Supreme Court developed a test to determine whether or not misstatements and affidavits for search warrants require suppression of evidence. And there's two prongs. Prong number one, the affiant stated false information in the affidavit knowingly and intentionally, or with a reckless disregard for the truth. If it's mere negligence or an innocent mistake, it doesn't count. So prong number one is you've got to be able to show that there was false information in the affidavit, knowing and intentional, or with reckless disregard for the truth. And then prong two is the remaining allegations. If you extract the false one, what's left is insufficient to support probable cause. If that's the case, everything is gone. It's all thrown out.
Right.
Now, intent can be proven under this test by an officer's omitting facts. Right. And that's a really interesting point for defense lawyers. So when we ultimately get to review this affidavit, we're looking for two things. Well, we're looking for many things, but the first two things we're looking for are whether or not there is any provable false statement. Again, either knowing and intentional or with reckless disregard for the truth. That's issue number one, right? If we find that, then we know we've got something to latch onto. But the second thing we're looking for, we've already debriefed our client. We already know what the deal is. Our client has presumably given us all of the knowledge that he or she has. And then we're looking at it for what didn't the cops say? What did they omit? What facts did they fail to tell the judge which would have made a difference in this case? And if the omissions are material, then bam, you can wind up with a suppression.
I'll give you.
Hang on 1 second before you give it to us. So the other things I want to talk about are how do we get suppression? That's one way, by attacking the affidavit. Another way is if the warrant was overbroad, if it was too generalized and not particular enough. Remember that particularity requirement. Another way is if it was an insufficient description, which Ed talked about earlier about, maybe there's more than one Mar-a-Lago, right? And then staleness, Ed mentioned, again, there's a 10-day rule here in Florida. That's not the same rule across the country, and it's not the rule in the feds. But if they wait too long to serve the warrant, it may be stale. And finally, you have a lack of probable cause. Go ahead, Ed. Give us your statement.
When I was a prosecutor, there was a unit in a specific police department that was looking at a target. They followed the target all the way home. And when they got it, they saw him do a deal at the threshold, and they rushed the door, and they put their foot in the door so they could see in. And they saw, allegedly, from where they were standing, they saw some marijuana or a little bit of cocaine or something on a coffee table. And so they wanted to go get a warrant. Now, prior to getting the warrant, Michael, you know what they did for officer safety?
What's that?
Protective sweep, right? They did a protective sweep of the house to make sure that there was nobody else in the house and they would be safe. That's what that's for. That's the only reason for. One of the things that they did in that protective sweep, Michael, was they brought in a drug dog. to the protective sweep. But when I was reading the affidavit, I noticed that they never put in there. They said they knew where the room was that had the drugs, but they didn't say how they knew it. So I'm pressing one of the officers. He finally admitted to me, well, we brought in a drug dog. I said, well, you better put that in the affidavit. Why? Because had they left it out, a good lawyer like Michael or myself would have argued that the warrant was insufficient because they never told the judge that they inappropriately, unconstitutionally brought in a drug dog to sniff for the drugs in the house. Now, had they put it in and the judge approved the warrant anyway, they're off the hook. There's still an issue of how bad it is and is it completely unconstitutional and was that judge stupid for signing the warrant? But the officers now are off the hook. Otherwise, if they screw up, the warrant and really the evidence that they get from the warrant is what ends up being suppressed under what's called the exclusionary rule. So,
which is actually my next topic.
Sorry, brother. I know this stuff in my sleep.
Yeah, well, but it's important that people know it, and we've only got a couple minutes left, so I want to skip to that.
Like you said earlier, there's a lot going on from both sides, and everybody just needs to calm down a little bit. We don't even know.
You're not going to get the answers for a while. That's the bottom line.
I want to say something about how is it that he could have been cooperating, and then they get a warrant? Is that inappropriate?
Wait, let's hang on a second. We'll get there. I want to talk about the fruits of the poisonous tree and the exclusionary rule. Okay, just very briefly. So there's a legal concept called the fruits of the poisonous tree, and this came from a case called Wong Sung, Wongsun versus the United States, 371 U.S. 471 in 1963. So let me tell you what happened in Wong Sung. All right, in Wong Sung, there's these narcotics agents that had illegally, and it's established, they illegally entered this laundromat. And they got some guy named Toy to tell them that some other guy named Johnny was selling drugs. So the narcotics officers went to Johnny's house, they found the dope, they shook Johnny down, they made a deal, and Johnny gave up his supplier. Yes, his supplier was this guy named Wong Sung. So naturally, the narcotics agents go, they arrest Wong Sung, and for reasons unknown, several days after being arrested and then released, he returns to the police station on his own and voluntarily admits to the sale of narcotics. This case goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and it ultimately holds that because the initial entry into Toy's laundromat was illegal, everything that Toy said to them and all of the drugs that they recovered, all of it, was what they called the fruit of the poisonous tree and therefore had to be suppressed. Unfortunately for Wong Sung, the Supreme Court did not exclude his statement, and his statement ultimately was allowed in.
That brings me to what I was going to add. However, notice what I said at the very beginning of this whole thing with the warrants when they come to me, or when they would come to me or come to any good prosecutor. You still want the officer to independently corroborate. Why? Because it could save any problems. Independent corroboration can save problems, like Wong coming in on his own. The cops, what they did had nothing.
And I'm going to tell you guys how to avoid that in a minute, because we're going to hit my last mark momentarily. The fruit of the poisonous tree ultimately is an example of what we call the exclusionary rule. The exclusionary rule is a court-created mechanism to deter law enforcement officers from engaging in illegal or unconstitutional behavior in pursuit of their mandate of quashing crime. It's a remedy for a violation of an individual's constitutional rights. It is not a punishment to police officers per se, but if they illegally acquire evidence, that evidence gets suppressed or excluded pursuant to the exclusionary rule. And basically what that's supposed to do is it's supposed to say, look, by definition, criminals commit crimes, they violate the law, they violate the rules. That's what they do.
Right.
You, on the other hand, as law enforcement officers, are held to a higher standard, and you're not allowed to adopt a Machiavellian attitude of, hey, I'm Dirty Harry and I can do whatever I need to do as long as I get the bad guy. You, unfortunately, are bound by the Constitution and must play by the rules. And if you don't, the evidence that you secure.
When I was at the state attorney's office, something that my supervisors always bashed into my head, constantly heard them saying, we have to wear the white hats. And I firmly believe that. They didn't have to force me to do it, but it was repeated over and over by them, by us, by everybody, because we honestly believed that if we don't wear the white hats, if we start doing things illegally, which is what they're doing, then society loses faith in law enforcement. That's why law enforcement sometimes has to say, I know you did it. And you know I know you did it, but I just don't have enough right now to catch you. And
Yep.
you're lucky that I'm the Lone Ranger. You're lucky I'm Captain America, and I'm going to do things the right way, even though you and I both know you're a dirtbag and you're lying.
Now, when the Supreme Court created this exclusionary rule and started tossing evidence, there subsequently came a series of exceptions to this exclusionary rule.
Right.
Unfortunately for all of us, the law is not always black and white. In fact, it's almost never black and white. There are all sorts of shades of gray. And I don't want to go into all the exceptions. That's another topic for another show. But there are two major exceptions that I want to discuss in the last couple of minutes that we have, because they're going to dovetail into my pro tips that I'm about to give you. The two are consent in plain view. If the police have a warrant and they're legitimately on the premises, we already mentioned this, if they observe evidence of another crime, even something that's completely unrelated to why they're there, as long as they're lawfully there, and even if the warrant is ultimately kicked out, if they're acting in good faith and they believe that they're operating on a good warrant, that evidence is still coming in. Right. So just kind of like Wong Sung, it's attenuated from the illegal activity or from any impropriety, and it's still valid. How do you avoid that? Well, I'll give you the pro tip in a minute, but it's real simple. And it's the acronym that you've heard me say a million times. It's hashtag UpX2. Shut up and lawyer up. As for plain view, it's real simple. Here's your pro tip. If you have anything illegal, if you have contraband, if you have shit that you don't want anybody else to see, if there's stuff that's going to get you in trouble, don't put it up on the mantle like a goddamn trophy. Hide it. Secret it. Put it away. If it's sitting there in plain view, it's in plain sight. It's not hidden. It's not private. You don't have an expectation of privacy in stuff that's not privately, objectively meant to be private.
Yeah, don't leave it on the coffee table right by the front door or with the window wide open.
That's pro tip number one. Pro tip number two, be courteous. I don't care if the cops are being dicks. I don't care if you think that they're 100% wrong. Be courteous. Be polite. Be non-confrontational. Because anything else is going to result in possibly other charges. You could be hauled off the scene in handcuffs for resisting or obstructing or any of a number of charges that a creative cop can come up with. Battery on a law enforcement officer, attempted tampering with evidence. Who the hell knows what they could allege and trouble they could cause you just because you're being inappropriately behaved on scene. I
add a pro tip in there from my personal experience with thousands of law enforcement officers who served warrants. Even if they come in off the bat being total dicks, opening drawers and throwing them over, going to your wife's panty drawers and throwing all her panties on the floor, the bigger dick you become, the more they're going to do it. However, if you're extremely polite, I'm telling you, there's always that one or two guys in the unit that I don't want to cause waves. But if you're completely polite and they keep getting out of line, there's always that one or two guys who's going to look at the other guys in the unit and go, guys, you don't have to be such a dick. The guy's being a good guy about it or woman about it. Let's just get our warrant served and let's get out of here. So you always have a chance if you're polite and professional. But if you're not, I guarantee you it's just going to get worse.
Here's my final pro tips. As to consent, just say no. You do not ever have to consent to a search, ever, never. Doesn't mean that they won't search anyhow. Doesn't mean they won't get a warrant. Doesn't mean they won't detain you. But you do not have to say yes. Which dovetails into UpX2, right? Shut up and lawyer up. Invoke the fifth, invoke the sixth.
Look, it's just as easy, if I could, Mike, quickly. It's just as easy to say F you, go get a warrant. As
no, don't.
Say, I'm sorry. It's just as easy to say I'm sorry, but under the law, I believe you're required to get a warrant.
That's the be courteous.
I'd like you to go get a search warrant.
That's the be courteous and non-confrontational. Next, you are always free to ask what your rights are. There's no reason for you not to. Just do it politely and do it respectfully. You know, officer, where am I allowed to come with you? Am I allowed to watch? Where would you, where can I sit? Ask. Can I call my lawyer? Can my lawyer? Just ask. Because the worst thing that you're going to get is a no. Remain silent. Again, UpX2. Shut up. That's the shut up part. And here's the biggest pro tip of all. If the cops are serving a warrant, or even if they're not, if they're just on the roadside with you and they're investigating or whatever, Do not try to bargain or negotiate. Do not try to explain yourself. Do not try and broker a deal. Just keep your mouth shut, because every single word that comes out of your mouth is potential evidence and can potentially be used against you.
And on that note, you can tell your lawyer everything you want to say. You can tell Michael or I. You want to explain why there's whatever. You tell us. We can tell the officers. My client will tell you XYZ. That's not evidence. That's hearsay. That's me telling them, Michael telling them. So they can't use it. Now, he may want to use it at that moment, but if this case goes to trial, they're screwed. They can't use it.
For anybody who's interested, Chapter 933 of the Florida statutes deals with search warrants. There's plenty of them in there for you to peruse, and you can, be a self-proclaimed legal expert on the subject. But I want to leave you with this final thought.
Why did you put that out there?
I want to leave you with this final thought. I don't care if we're talking about Trump or anybody else under the sun. Do not jump to conclusions and do not be bullied by pundits, okay? The truth is, the media, all of these folks have an agenda. They're not giving you unbiased, unspun, pure journalistic fact. There are a couple out there. There still are a few good journalists. I mean, there are. But overall, you've got explosive pundit personalities that are doing their job. There's nothing wrong with what they do, but you have to recognize it for what it is. I mean, it's really, as to my mind, as silly as getting upset if a comedian makes a joke and you take it personally. It's a comedian doing their job. Get over it. And get over yourself.
Even some of these lawyers that are showing up on these shows, imagine what they're doing. Can you imagine they show up? You're asked to come on as an expert. You're trying to do it to build your practice, because that's why they do it. Let's be honest. They're not up there because they want to help. They're doing it to build their practice in wherever jurisdiction they're, so they can brag about how they're on CNN or Fox or wherever. And you come on and say, well, what's my opinion? We don't know anything, and we're not going to know anything. They'll never bring you back on. So some of them are also motivated to say, well, it could be this. Oh, I heard it. Shut the hell up. You don't know. And I want to say this before we go, Michael. He was cooperating. Probably, absolutely, sure he was. But we don't know if he was turning over what he wanted them to have. We don't know. I don't know why they got that warrant. Maybe there's somebody on the inside who said, hey, listen, he says he turned everything over to you, but he's lying because I know there's some stuff in his safe. We don't know. We don't know.
And there's no rule, by the way, that says even if you are cooperating that they can't serve a warrant. So
that's what I was going to say.
At the end of the day,
he's cooperating, but he's just taking too long, and law enforcement just doesn't want to deal with it. They have that right to say, screw you. We don't have to let you cooperate.
What we want to leave you with is really the overarching idea that the government may be completely 100% wrong here. And if they are, believe me, everyone's going to know it, just not until the time is right.
Correct.
On the flip side of the coin, the government could have been 100% appropriate and correct here. To say that they didn't need to send 30 agents to his property and they didn't need to do this,
that's ridiculous.
It's nonsense. It's absurd. They do what they do. That is their call. That is their practice. That is their protocol. That is their procedure.
If I may, Michael, if they had sent 10 agents, they would have been there for 24 hours, and everybody would have been complaining that why did they take 24 hours to search?
The point is, it's rhetoric, it's explosive, and it is not productive. And our goal here is to be productive and to be accurate. So now you understand. The bottom line is, with Trump, with Breonna Taylor, go guys, Google what Ed was telling you, that they're now thinking that there may have been material misrepresentations made in the affidavit. Well, they wouldn't know that until after they got the affidavit. They wouldn't know that until after they scoured the scene and conducted a complete forensic autopsy of the facts and circumstances of the case. It's what we call 20/20 hindsight. And unfortunately, we don't have knowledge of the future in the present. But we do have knowledge of the past in the present. And as soon as these issues become ripe and we have the requisite knowledge, then we will be able to form intelligent conclusions, which, by the way, may differ. Right. And it may be because of politics, it may be because of whatever, but at the end of the day, at least we will have evidence and facts to put in front of us.
I'll give you one example of how both sides...
Do it quick, because we're way over.
Ridiculous. The right keeps calling it a raid, and the left keeps saying it's a search. I got news for you. They're both right. It's a raid. It's a search. Tomato. Call it whatever the hell you want.
Yep.
You're right. That's what they do. That's what government does.
But the idea is that it's spin. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. What matters is a judge signed off on a warrant based on an affidavit and potentially follow-up questions, which we don't know whether happened or not. But if there are ever charges filed, you can bet your bottom dollar everybody in this planet is going to know, and we're all going to be able to look at facts and then come to conclusions. But more importantly,
I want to say 30 seconds.
the judge will be able to review everything and come to a legal conclusion as to what's admissible and what isn't. Go ahead, and then we're done.
You said we'll never get the affidavit, you're right 99% of the time. In this case, because of I think the huge public interest and the need for the public to get it, what I think Trump's lawyers will do and should do is tell the court to do another ex parte review in his chambers to see what part of the affidavit can be released and everything else be redacted. That's what I would do if I were his lawyers, because there's no way in hell that a judge is going to release that affidavit giving Trump the information of who told him.
That affidavit is not coming out unless and until he is charged. That's the only prediction that I can make here. None of us are going to see it. Anyhow, we're over, and I apologize for taking a little more time, but as you guys can tell, this is, it's not easy stuff here. And I know I spent a good deal of time talking about history, but history is really important because that's how we get to where we are, just like we're going to look at the history of the Trump search warrant to get to where we are with whether or not it was lawfully acquired, whether or not it was properly served, and whether or not any evidence, if there is any evidence, is going to be admissible. So history is really the best guide that we have to moving forward. With that, I want to thank Ed. Thank you very much. Really, your knowledge on the subject as a prosecutor and a defense attorney is invaluable.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.
And thank you guys for listening and paying attention to episode 48. I can't believe we're closing in on our 50th episode. But hopefully we'll see you next week on the 22nd with a new topic, a new subject, and we'll hopefully be able to be back at your service. Thank you guys again very much. And I'm sorry we didn't get to show the other. Actually, wait a minute. Before we go, just one more thing. If our producer would just put up picture number 7, because this is what happens. This is what happens when you do not up X2.
Yeah.
You see that? Founding fathers roll over in their graves. Please up X2. Thanks very much again, y'all. We really appreciate your time. Have a great day, everyone. And we'll look forward to being at your service next week.
Bye-bye.